Human trafficking is a sensitive topic of research in any country, but the security and cultural context of Afghanistan make it particularly challenging to research. My name is Sarah Cramer. I'm a project director at Samuel Hall Consulting, and this session is dedicated to the most prevalent forms of child trafficking in Afghanistan. The information I will be presenting is based on research my team and I conducted in 9 Afghan provinces in the summer of 2013. Samuel Hall Consulting was commissioned to conduct this research for the International Organization for Migration, and the findings will soon be made available in a report. While our research looked at trafficking of victims of all ages, this presentation will focus on child trafficking. So I'll begin by introducing the most prevalent forms of child trafficking in Afghanistan, with illustrative examples. Next, I'll present some of the causes and determinants of child trafficking. And finally, I'll conclude with some of our findings on community perceptions, which create tremendous challenges for counter-trafficking efforts. Children are at risk of trafficking for both labor and sexual exploitation in Afghanistan. It is an accepted fact that a majority of the trafficking is internal. In fact, more than half of the 95 victims we interviewed did not even leave their province. Trafficking for labor exploitation is most common in illicit sectors such as brickmaking, construction, and mining, which involve arduous physical labor at low wages. We interviewed a 28-year-old brickmaker working as a bonded laborer in the district of Desabs, which is a major hub for brick production just outside the capital city of Kabul. His 4 children, all under the age of 13, work at the kiln alongside their father. He took an advance of roughly $400 from a recruiter when he needed an operation on his leg. He makes less than $7 for every 1,000 bricks he and his children produce. The family lives on site in housing provided by the kiln owner, and they cannot leave until the debt is repaid. As in the case of this brickmaker, trafficking in illicit sectors typically involves a recruitment process. The head of household will agree for one or multiple members of a family to fulfill the agreed duties. This often involves the giving of a loan or advance to workers who must then work at very low wages to pay it back. This practice is known as debt bondage, and as is the case in many South Asian countries, the debt is transferred to children in the case of parental death. The pressure for children to work in illicit sectors often comes from the head of household, not the employer, as they want to pay off their debt as quickly as possible. Debt bondage is a standard characteristic of the brickmaking industry in Afghanistan, but it has also been documented in such diverse activities as shopkeeping, manufacturing, construction, and agriculture. Both genders are targeted for illicit labor activities, albeit in different ways. Girls usually work alongside their family members until they reach puberty, at which point they are generally restricted from working in places where they can be seen by men. They can still be targeted for work that is hidden from public view, such as carpet weaving or domestic work. Boys, on the other hand, are most desirable for labor exploitation in their adolescent years, when they are perceived to be as strong, yet easier to control than men. They are also allowed to move more easily in public spaces and can be recruited to work far from home, either in another province or neighboring country. Trafficking for labor exploitation in illicit sectors is much less visible due to the illegal nature of the activities. Trafficking in drug cultivation, processing, and smuggling is the most common, but children are also coerced into performing suicide attacks and criminal activities such as theft. Households are much less involved in decision-making during recruitment into illicit sectors, and individuals, especially male youth, are the main targets. Most interviewed victims reported that their families were not aware of the conditions of their work before they began. A number of cases revealed absent or strained relationships with their families. Physical violence played a much bigger role in recruitment into illicit sectors, while debt bondage was less common. We interviewed a 17-year-old boy in a juvenile retention center in Jalalabad who had been recruited from Logar province to go to Pakistan to study at a madrasa. Several days after arriving, he said he and 2 other boys were taken at gunpoint to a remote location in the mountains. They were forced to work and also sexually abused. When the boys learned that they were to be sent to fight in Afghanistan, possibly to be used as suicide bombers, they decided to escape. They were picked up at the border crossing under suspicion of planning a suicide attack, which is why they are now in the juvenile retention center. It's possible that they could have been planning an attack, but it is also clear that there was coercion and exploitation in the lead up to their eventual arrest. An increasing number of children have been used in suicide attacks in Afghanistan. This boy was nearly an adult, but much younger children have also been coerced into suicide attacks through deception. Coerced children often do not understand the implications of their actions or are led to believe that they will be spared in the attack. Moving on now to trafficking for sexual exploitation, the most prominent forms in Afghanistan can be broken down into three main categories. First, forced prostitution. Second, baazi, literally boy play. And third, sexual slavery. First, forced prostitution is when victims, generally girls, are forced to perform sexual acts with a client who pays a fee. This research revealed that forced marriage was actually being used as a vehicle for forced prostitution in many cases. Out of 13 interviewed victims of forced prostitution, 8 of them were first forced into marriage. In some cases, victims were prostituted only months after their marriage, indicating that the spouse or his family had arranged for the marriage with the intent of using the new wife as a prostitute. It is unclear whether this is in fact a new trend or an older practice that is only now coming to light. Girls can also be abducted for the purpose of forced prostitution. One 12-year-old girl that we interviewed from Pakistan was abducted by a neighbor and forced to work as a prostitute in Afghanistan. She was forced to drink alcohol every morning, and then 4 to 5 clients would be brought to her throughout the day. The girl's family searched for her, and her uncle, under the guise of seeking a brothel, was able to track her down and report her location to the police. The brothel was raided, and the girl, fortunately, is now living in a shelter in Kabul. However, her parents must now prove that she did not consent to the prostitution before she can return to her home. Consent should not even be an issue in this case, given the victim's age, but this also demonstrates how the burden of proof is often placed on victims to prove their innocence, rather on the system to prove guilt. The second form, baazi, or literally boy play, is a traditional practice where boys are kept by wealthy, powerful men and trained to dance and entertain other male guests while dressed as a woman. They are also exploited sexually by their owners or their guests. We interviewed a 13-year-old boy who was convinced by his older cousin to travel with him from Kunduz, a province in the north, to Kandahar, a southern province, to seek work in a hotel. In the first few days at the hotel, the boy worked as a dishwasher. After a few days, the boy's cousin left, and the victim discovered that he had been sold to the hotel owner for the purpose of sexual exploitation. In addition to being sexually exploited by the hotel owner, the boy has been trained to dance when the hotel owner is entertaining guests. The boy is afraid to leave as the hotel owner has threatened him that he will track him down wherever he goes. He also knows that he has limited options if he were to get away, as this activity carries considerable shame. The wealthy, powerful men that keep these boys are often very open about this practice, as it can in fact increase their social standing. The full weight of the shame of this activity is borne by the victims, and the victims alone. The third form of trafficking for sexual exploitation groups other forms of sexual slavery. These include cases in which boys or girls are held by an individual or group of individuals for sexual exploitation. For girls, this practice is very hidden. The girls are sold or abducted and kept in a private space. For boys, it can be much more public. We encountered boys that were being exploited in hotels. What differentiates this practice from the baazi practice is that the boys are not trained to dance or perform. This was found to be the case in Herat province, where baazi is not a traditional practice, but we had reports of boys who were working in hotels in the daytime being exploited and held captive by management at night. We've also had reports of boys being held at police checkpoints for the purpose of sexual exploitation, and also boys being kept as assistant truck drivers, although the intention of them being kept was for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Male and female victims are coerced into sex trafficking in distinctly different ways. Boys can be more easily approached than girls for abduction or deceptive recruitment, as they have more mobility outside of the home. When family members are involved, they receive a payment to transfer control of a male minor to another individual outside of the family for the purpose of sexual exploitation. Recruitment of boys for sexual exploitation tapers off as they reach the end of adolescence. For girls, it continues into adulthood. Family members are frequently complicit in the trafficking of their female relatives for sexual exploitation. Girls almost never participate in the decision-making that leads to their trafficking. A father, spouse, or spouse's family either prostitute the girls directly or sell them to another individual to be used as a sexual slave. I mentioned forced marriage earlier as being used as a vehicle for trafficking for sexual exploitation. There are also other forms of forced marriage that can qualify as child trafficking that do not fit neatly into the categories of labor or sexual exploitation. Determining whether a forced marriage is in fact trafficking requires case-by-case analysis. The most common motivations for forced marriage, according to interviewed community leaders, include the practices of baad, baad, and forced marriage for debt repayment. Baad is the transfer of a girl to another family through marriage for conflict resolution. In theory, the practice is supposed to bring families closer together, resolving the conflict. In reality, the girl pays the price for her family's wrongdoings. Baad is considered a traditional practice within Afghan customary justice, but it is not religiously condoned. A large majority of interviewed religious leaders actually disapproved of the practice. In fact, disapproval of baad was higher amongst religious leaders than other community leaders. The second practice, badal, is the exchange of daughters to reduce dowry costs. The exchange of daughters is considered to cancel the need for a dowry. Extreme cases of underage marriage appear to be more prevalent within this type of arrangement. The third situation is forced marriage for debt repayment. This is the giving of a daughter to cancel out household debt. This practice is most documented in the sector of poppy production, but it is not exclusive to this sector. Now that we've identified the most prevalent patterns of child trafficking in Afghanistan, we'll take a look at the causes and determinants that make children vulnerable to these practices. Our research highlights two key drivers: economic drivers, including chronic poverty and debt, and migration and displacement. Chronic poverty is prevalent in nearly all of the victim cases analyzed. The average daily income within surveyed victims' families is 50 cents per person per day, well below the national poverty line of 85 cents per person per day. As mentioned previously, debt plays a direct role in trafficking for labor exploitation through debt bondage. Employers in Afghanistan do not charge interest or fees, as profiting from a loan is considered to be against Islam. Rather, the advance is used purely as a means to control the victim and impose exploitative labor terms, initiating a cycle of debt that is then transferred between generations. Debt plays an indirect role in situations of trafficking for sexual exploitation. It often weighs on the decision-making of a household, but does not necessarily come into play as one of the tools used for coercion or exploitation. A majority of interviewed victims of sexual exploitation reported household debt. Trafficking cannot be addressed without considering the broader context of migration. Like many Afghans, victims of trafficking often have a history of displacement. Half of interviewed victims had been displaced, either to another country, internally, or a combination of both. 1/3 of surveyed victims were forced to flee to another country, usually Pakistan or Iran, at some point prior to their trafficking experience. Of these cases, most victims were regular migrants while in exile, meaning that they did not have a legal status or as a refugee or asylum seeker. Their irregular status is likely to have made them more vulnerable to exploitative practices. More than a quarter of victims had been internally displaced. Despite the small sample we were working with, the former IDP victims originated from a total of 12 provinces, indicating the widespread nature of insecurity and internal displacement in Afghanistan. Given the impact of the current transition in Afghanistan and of increasing insecurity nationwide, these drivers, both economic and migratory, will only worsen, which will likely have an impact on trafficking trends. Internal displacement has been flagged by the UN and donors as a top humanitarian priority in a country where over 600,000 people are internally displaced and where 6 million people are returning refugees. Tackling the problem of child trafficking in Afghanistan is particularly challenging given the community attitudes and misperceptions associated with trafficking practices, especially those of a sexual nature. The first hurdle is the confusion between smuggling and trafficking. Trafficking is often confused with smuggling, even by those involved in counter-trafficking efforts. Victims are often not identified or are misidentified as criminals. Many victims do not even recognize themselves as victims and feel they cannot seek assistance due to the shame of their experience. This lack of understanding poses challenges for counter-trafficking that are both bottom-up in terms of victim reporting and top-down in terms of identification and response. The second hurdle is the perceived normalcy or acceptability of certain human trafficking practices. Some practices are even considered by some to have a positive impact. Overall, a quarter of interviewed community leaders said that trafficking for labor exploitation could actually help households in poor economic situations. Even more, one-third of community leaders asserted that forced marriage for conflict resolution, the practice of baad, is important for maintaining peace in the community. Other exploitative activities are widely condemned, but fail to distinguish between the perpetrator and the victim, a third hurdle. Nearly all interviewed community leaders stated that the government should punish traffickers who exploit people for sexual purposes. Paradoxically, they also believe that prostitutes should be punished by the government regardless of whether or not the people involved were forced into prostitution. Unfortunately, the criminalization of victims remains a common occurrence in Afghanistan. Girls, especially, are often imprisoned for running away, even if they are fleeing a situation of abuse or exploitation, as it is considered a moral crime. I'd like to conclude with a few key points for practice drawn from this research. First, the local context should always be the starting point. Assisting trafficking victims in Afghanistan requires more than just establishing protection services. For victims to come forward without fear of recrimination, there needs to be a fundamental change in the way society views victims. Second, messaging on child trafficking should be carefully constructed. Broader awareness of child trafficking practices has grown significantly in Afghanistan. While they may not always call it trafficking, a majority of interviewed community leaders were aware of practices such as forced prostitution and bonded labor happening in their provinces. As an unintended consequence, greater visibility of trafficking has given a false impression to many Afghans that human trafficking is a new practice. This misperception is dangerous as it can be used to justify draconian counter-trafficking responses that limit the rights and mobility of vulnerable populations, especially girls. For example, communities that are afraid that their girls can be forced into prostitution may use this as an excuse to keep women at home, preventing them from going to school. Finally, looking ahead, the instability and uncertainty of the political transition in Afghanistan are likely to increase individual and household vulnerability to trafficking in the coming years. An economic recession is projected to accompany the decrease in spending by external actors, an inevitable reality given the staggering influx of funds over the past decade. Should the political transition or 2014 presidential elections result in increasing violence, resulting internal displacement and migration abroad would further exacerbate vulnerabilities. Households already in trafficking situations, such as bonded laborers, will be vulnerable to even more exploitative and abusive forms of trafficking should their economic situation worsen. In the meantime, at a time of transition, the government still needs support from donors and the international community on counter-trafficking measures, whether in terms of training police officers to better identify and handle trafficking cases, providing protection services such as shelters, or improving implementation of the 2008 Afghan counter-trafficking law. Our research on the trafficking patterns and counter-trafficking measures in Afghanistan are presented in much more detail in the full report, which will be made public by Samuel Hall and IOM in 2013. Please visit our website, samuelhall.org, for the latest research on migration and displacement in Afghanistan, economic development, and other topics.